think, as I said, I think this line, Abby can see you naked, really speaks to that.
Well, I mean, I hope he doesn't see this interview. Otherwise, I will be in trouble. But I can always say you enticed me into this conversation. But anyway, we have about 15 minutes, Tom. And if you could say a few things about the Tigray war, and especially about the Pretoria Agreement and what it meant and all that. You say in the book, and this is something you implicitly say, not quite explicit. It's been a while since I wrote the book. Maybe I'm misrepresenting. But you say that the people who facilitated the agreement, the Americans and the others, were not really interested in pursuing justice in Tigray. What is the thinking there? Why is it that nobody seems to be interested in dispensing justice to the millions of victims in Tigray?
Yeah, I mean, I do think that stems from this idea, which many will say is flawed. I think is flawed. This idea that there is an inherent tension or contradiction between the demands of stability and peace and those of justice. They clearly pay lip service to the idea of justice and accountability, but I mean, right at this point, there was a point where actually it looked like maybe IMF or World Bank funding was going to be tied to, and they will say, well, actually there is a transitional justice process going on. That's what they'll say. But anyone who's looked at the matter for a second knows that's a joke. I think ultimately they did not make it contingent. It has gone ahead anyway. It turned out it was contingent on currency reform, obviously, not on like genuine transitional justice. So that ship has sailed in my view. I think that is a great loss, because I think whether it's Ethiopia or another context, but the cycle of violence, which I talk about in the book and which I find really, I think is really important to pay attention to, can't be broken when you have just the kind of let us move on, pretend it never happened, and we know what that will lead. There's a generational damage, and a generation which will hold on to what happened. And they're not going to forgive and forget for without any effort being made to pursue the kind of justice and accountability and then reconciliation that's needed for that to happen. I mean, people are not just going to forgive and forget. I don't just mean Tigrayans. I mean anyone who's been a victim in this war the last 6 years. That's going to stay with them, and then these things return, whether it will be a generation's time or maybe sooner. There has been no, and this is part of why the Pretoria Agreement is insufficient, or will not, because it's not been an attempt to grapple with the comprehensively with the causes and consequences of the conflicts in Ethiopia. It was the Pretoria Agreement, like, don't get me wrong, I think it was desperately needed. Like, I see it saved thousands, hundreds of thousands of lives at the time. It was we can't like dismiss that. And was there any other way to go about it? Like, I genuinely don't know. If you have a government or a figure in Abiy who was insistent that the talks happen on his terms, one of which is a bilateral agreement with the TPLF and to the exclusion of all other actors. That was the only option on the table. I understand, to be sympathetic to the American and other and African and whoever mediators involved, it was it was a very, very difficult set of circumstances they were dealing with, to have achieved. I didn't predict a Pretoria agreement, and like I think 2 weeks before we were expecting the Eritrean army and the Ethiopian army to kind of blow through, attempt to recapture Mekelle, install a kind of puppet administration again, and this would all, the war would have continued. It didn't happen, and credit to, I think, to the Tigrayan leadership for compromising, and ultimately he hasn't delivered on it, but he hasn't delivered on these. But Abiy at the time did make some concessions. He talked to the diplomats in the room. He was the one on the phone from Addis on the phone. He made concessions over the question of Western Tigray in particular, and the sequencing of disarmament. Obviously, that has not actually happened. So, but it brought a reprieve at least, and brought about the ceasefire or cessation of hostilities. What it was not was a comprehensive political settlement. And what would have been needed, from the international community, would have been a degree of engagement and persistence, and persistently pushing both sides to actually implement. Leverage would need to have been properly on the table. That wasn't there. Frankly, and I say this in the epilogue, most of the international community now has treated Ethiopia as a problem solved. It slipped precipitously down the agenda. There was this weird, like, brief moment in 2021 where, for a variety of reasons, and I'm loath to credit Biden or Blinken because I don't think they deserve it, but Ethiopia was put quite high up on their list of kind of foreign policy crises to deal with, briefly. Once the Pretoria Agreement was struck, it just like fell right down. And now with the war in Sudan, the international community or the West or whoever simply does not have the interest, desire, and capacity to deal with multiple horn crises at once. Apparently, that's not an excuse. That's not an excuse. That's a condemnation. But like they don't, and there's a tendency to, they have, I think, on some level, outsourced kind of the region to the Gulf. That's a whole different question. I don't know if we have time to go into. Something I'm very interested in at the moment because I'm working a lot on the Sudan conflict. But I mean, just the level of disengagement. Mike Hammer's doing his best, and I have a lot of respect for him. But you need to have the weight of, the leverage, the interest of senior leadership in DC above all, but elsewhere as well. Other powers, China does not seem interested in any way. Europeans are not seriously engaged. Britain, where I come from, is not taken seriously anyway. So there aren't many options, and they are not. I think, just to go back to where we started on the primacy of geopolitics now, it's, as you well know, it's Ukraine and Gaza at top, and there's a third. The international community basically can deal with apparently two major conflicts. Sudan is kind of talked of as a kind of footnote, despite what I'm trying now to help nudge it higher up, and it's starting to gain some traction, I think, but Ethiopia has just dropped totally down. And then you get nonsense headlines like from Paul Collier in the FT the other day, sort of saying investors are kind of, chomping at the bit to go back into Ethiopia because it's got this like visionary reformist leadership who are sort of pursuing reforms whilst maintaining their policy autonomy, which is like ridiculous. But the headlines are now totally different. I mean, I think they were. I don't think Abiy's government probably was particularly keen on the headline I had in The Economist the week of the IMF announcement, which was Ethiopia's in the grip of an epidemic, a kidnapping epidemic. But from my point of view, that's the headline story, which is that Ethiopia is lawless, and you can't. It's not a safe place for any of its citizens. So any of the discussions around foreign investment and economic reforms, I think, are just totally insufficient to the scale of the realities of what is happening.